Hey guys, John with Scottsdale Living. Really excited. We're here today with a local renowned artist and author, Steve Bergsman, from the Mesa area, right?
From Mesa, yes.
Fantastic. Steve has been a journalist for many years, written many different books and publications. What we're really going to kind of talk a lot about today is the movie The Wanderers and the book Steve wrote about The Wanderers. But you've also got some other books that came out, and we can kind of chat about those as well. But tell me, so you've got an event coming up next Monday at the JCCs, right?
Yes, so the JCC in Scottsdale, it's an event. It's about one of my books. I had 4 books come out this year, and one of them was The Wanderers, which was a look at how this cult movie from 1979 actually, why it got made.
Right.
And you think, oh, well, some studio just okays a movie and that's it.
Sure.
But there's sort of as I found out, there's sort of an evolution of why some movies get made. So in the case of The Wanderers, it was very complex. The background of making the movie was simple.
Sure.
And but the background was very complex because it all started with the concept of teen gangs, which was a problem or perceived problem in the 1950s. So there were a number of teen gangs in cities, usually the bigger cities at the time.
So what's kind of the thoughts about that? I mean, why were the gangs so prevalent then, especially teen gangs?
Well, the teen gangs were mostly territorial in the big cities. So they were there to claim their block or blocks or area of the city, and they wanted to show that they predominated in that area. And sometimes it was for protection. They didn't want other teen gangs to come in. And they weren't the violent gangs that we began to see in the 80s, such as the Crips and the Bloods.
Sure.
So again, they were, young men just hanging out, and they were more of an annoyance, but it began to get more violent.
Okay.
And guns began to appear in the neighborhoods, but there were so few guns that they used to make their own, and they called them zip guns.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I've heard of that before. I didn't realize that's what it was.
So it was like a handmade gun, a zip gun, and it would shoot one bullet.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing about the 1950s and teens, it was as if America discovered teens for the first time.
Yeah.
Oh, my God, we have teenagers. But what
do we do with them?
What happened was, so we went from World War I to the Depression to World War II. So teens sort of got involved in world events. They went to wars, and in the Depression, they had to help families stay above poverty. So there was really none of that life for a teenager that we know today.
Right.
But after World War II and prosperity came to America, teenagers had more free time. They had more pennies and dollars in their wallet.
So it's really interesting. I never really thought of that progression, but it makes total sense. I mean, and even I would assume if you go back to the 1800s, I mean, you didn't get to be a teen. You were either a child or you were working, right?
Because it was an agricultural country for a long time. You worked on your farm,
right,
with your parents. That was your job,
right?
And so suddenly we had teenagers, and parents were like just frightened of everything about teenagers. But part of that was the teen gangs, and some of them were dangerous. And I began The Wanderers with a story of a teenager being killed in teen gang violence, and that sort of tipped the scales to the newspapers that have about all this teen gang business in the 50s. So that was the first part. And then came, we skip a few years forward, and Dion, a popular American singer in the 50s and 60s, he had a song called The Wanderers.
Yeah.
So it was a big song about 1960, I would say. And that spurred another young man. So Dion was from the Bronx. And there were a lot of famous teen gangs in the Bronx, which is a borough of New York.
Yep.
So Dion was from the Bronx, and he actually was in a gang when he was young.
Right.
And his first group was Dion and the Belmonts. And actually, all the Belmonts and Dion were in gangs at one time,
wow, okay.
youth gangs.
So they kind of grew out of that.
Yeah, they grew out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, The Wanderer, the song, kind of spurred another Bronx boy, a kid named Richard Price, to write a book called The Wanderers.
Right.
And it focused on teen gangs. And
so is this a biography at the time, or
no? It came out in 1970, around 1974.
Okay.
Richard Price by that time was 24 years old. His first book, and it was very, very popular, and it became sort of a cult classic as well. So his book,
but he didn't grow up in that environment then, right?
He was a middle class. He was a lower middle class boy. So he grew up in public supported housing, you might say. And actually, from 1 to 5, for me, I did the same in New York. I grew up in public supported housing. And then my father got a better job, and we moved to the burbs.
Right. Yeah, totally. Made the progression, right?
So Richard Price wrote this book. So this is what the book, my book is about. So we had the teen gangs, and I talk about how the song "The Wanderer" was created, and then how Richard Price wrote his book "The Wanderers."
Right.
And this is all against the backdrop of America focusing on teens, and essentially the first teen gang movie was The Wild One. With Marlon Brando, where a motorcycle gang invades a small town.
Right. Yeah.
So
I remember this.
So the odd thing about that movie was it was based on a real event. So after World War II, a lot of the GIs came back, but just like after the Vietnam War, for example, there was a lot of PTSD, PTSD.
And they didn't know what to do with themselves.
They didn't know what to do with themselves. And a lot of them organized into motorcycle clubs. And there was a rally in a small city in California around 1947, and Hollister. And thousands of these motorcyclists showed up and took over the town. So that became the basis of the movie The Wild One. And that was the first sort of it was a very popular teen movie. And then you skip forward a few years and you get the next popular teen movie, a little more violent, and it was called The Blackboard Jungle. And what made The Blackboard Jungle, besides was a very good movie, but it began with Bill Haley and the Comets singing "Rock Around the Clock." If you were a teenager and you went to see this movie, you sat down, the lights went on, there was a little verbiage in front, and then boom, it's "Rock Around the Clock." And teenagers went wild. They were dancing in the aisles, and "Rock Around the Clock" became a #1 record in 1955. So, and this was really, they if you're thinking, okay, when did rock and roll happen? It was really 1955 with "Rock Around the Clock." 1956 was Elvis, and suddenly rock and roll has taken over. So, so it was Blackboard Jungle. Sidney Poitier was in it. He was the good guy. The bad kid was Vic Morrow, another who also became a popular actor.
Absolutely.
So, and then there were many cheap B-movie variations of the teen gang.
So this is a genre during the time.
This was a very popular genre. And we don't have drive-ins anymore, but there used to be drive-ins in America, and these were very popular with teenagers because they can go park with their girlfriend, watch
sneak in a beer or something, totally,
and make out in the backseat, kind of thing.
100%.
So this was all popular in the 50s, going into the 60s. But you skip forward into the 70s, and those teenagers are now grown up. And they're about 40 years old, let's say. And they have the first wave of pop nostalgia come in. And then we start seeing a new wave of everything. So we have West Side Story, the penultimate teen gang movie, but in 1958 it started out as a Broadway play.
Right.
So that was the first of sort of our nostalgia for teens. So that was in 58. But then you skip forward to the 70s and you have Grease. Grease also started out as a theatrical production, and it was very popular.
I didn't realize that. So the theater presentation came first before the movie.
Theater presentation of Grease came first, and then came the movie. And then in the early 70s, television, you had Happy Days.
Yeah.
And then you had a resurgence of sort of teen movies that look back at the music and the times of the 50s. It wasn't a teen gang movie per se, but it was sort of in that genre. That was American Graffiti.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And there was another movie that really wasn't very good. It was called The Lords of Flatbush.
Okay.
And that was about 1974. And it was really the first movie for Sylvester Stallone and Henry Winkler.
Oh, okay.
Henry Winkler, who went on to Happy Days.
Yeah. So this is pre-Rocky?
This is pre-Rocky.
Yeah,
this is his first shot at.
Sure.
I think he had appeared as walk-ons in about a film or two.
Okay.
But he was actually one of the 4 stars of The Lords of Flatbush, and it really wasn't a great movie. And then by 1979, we get 2, not 1, but 2 cult movies about teen gangs. The craziest one was The Warriors.
Okay.
And it came out months before The Wanderers. So this is what happened. So The Warriors came out, and essentially it's a great movie. And it's a pure slice of adrenaline.
Sure.
And I don't know if you know New York very well.
A little bit, yeah. Been there quite a few times. But.
So a gang in Coney Island, which is really at the southern end of the subway system, travels to the top end, the northern end of the subway system in the Bronx for a convocation of all the teen gangs in New York City at the time. So there's hundreds of teen gang members meeting in the North Bronx. And because they want to unite and sort of take over the city as a whole group. But the fellow whose idea that was and who was speaking gets assassinated at that meeting.
Oh, wow.
And they blame this teen gang called the Warriors that lived in the Bronx, in Coney Island.
Okay.
So now the Warriors have to ride the subway system from the Bronx to Coney Island with all the other teen gangs in the city after them.
Oh, man.
So that's the story of the Warriors. Great movie. Warriors come out, and for some reason at that time, the reaction was so visceral for teens, they started fighting in the movie.
Oh, wow.
So there was all these, and it was one of those things that got caught up in the press. It really wasn't that many incidents, but enough that the press.
Well, the press loves it, right?
Yeah. Oh, movie spurs violence in theaters.
Of course. Yeah.
So what looked like it was going to be a best-selling movie had to be pulled.
Right. Oh, so it actually got pulled out of the theater?
Yeah, so it got pulled. So that was early in 79. Late in 79 comes The Wanderers. Completely different gang movie. It's really, at the heart of it, it's kind of a sweet movie, and it's a coming-of-age movie.
Sure.
And it's a bit more comedic than The Warriors. But because of what happened with The Warriors, they put it out maybe for a week.
Oh, right.
The Wanderers, and then pulled that one too.
Wow. Okay.
So nobody ever saw The Wanderers.
Right.
And then, years later, it starts appearing on what was then, we didn't have streaming, we had cable.
Yeah, sure.
So, and then people discovered The Wanderers, and it became sort of a cult movie.
Gets a little following behind it, right? That's crazy.
So but there are Wanderers clubs all over the world, in Japan, in Europe. Matter of fact, the Wanderers 79 Facebook page comes out of Germany.
Okay, crazy, right?
That's how popular this movie is. So, so that's sort of the whole history of the Wanderers, right there.
From the movie to the book to your book, right?
Right. Yeah.
What a progression. So, I mean, what brings you to this whole thing? I mean, is it growing up there? Is it the experience, or what really captivates you about it?
Well, one thing. So I was born in 1949.
Sure.
So I grew up in the 50s.
Right.
So I have a sort of a warm nostalgic feel
Absolutely.
for the 1950s.
Right.
And so I'm a big fan of the Wanderers movies, and I'm actually a big fan of the Warriors movies. Movie as well. So I sort of have a kindness to that era. Anyway, my agent at the time, he said, "Why don't you write a book about a popular movie?" And there are a lot of books about the making of different movies out there, and
behind the scenes, how it went down, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I said, and I thought The Wanderers would make was so popular as a cult film. I thought it would make a good book.
So, what was the push to get the movie made? So you talked about that for just a brief second a few minutes ago, but like, what was the impetus behind it? I mean, was there a driving force that said, "Hey, we've got to get this movie out there"?
Well, what happened was, so it was a kind of a cultish book. And one of the reasons for it, so this was Richard Price, who's a very famous author and screenwriter, actually. And his first book, and it was an odd book because it wasn't one story that you follow through from beginning to end. It was a series of vignettes that were all tied together.
Sure.
And it was pretty crude. For the time,
right?
The language, what happened to the people, and just people liked the fact that it was different.
Sure.
And it was a good book. So that book was out there, and a director, Philip Kaufman, who started directing movies in the 60s, very small independent movies.
Sure.
And then gradually you get better movies and better
absolutely.
movies.
Got a few more dollars in his pocket and totally.
And finally by 1970s, late 70s, he does the remake of a 50s movie called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. So his remake was even better than the original.
Sure.
And very scary, and it was a box office hit.
Right.
But as he's working on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, his son says, "Dad, you got to see this book. This would make a great book." His son was a big fan of The Wanderers by Richard Price. So Philip Kaufman reads the book, loves it, and he's working with his wife, Rose Kaufman, and they said, "Okay, well, while you're shooting an Invasion of the Body Snatchers, let's sort of get started on a screenplay here." So Philip Kaufman and Rose Kaufman wrote the first screenplay to the movie.
Okay.
Now he's in California shooting, in San Francisco shooting Invasion of the Body Snatchers, but he has to commute to New York to sort of get underway with the Wanderers, because that's where it had to be shot. It had to be shot in the Bronx,
right?
Plus, he had to get extras and all that, and guys to play all the big roles in the movie.
So, little side question. So, the author, Richard Price, right, is also a screenwriter. So, was he ever brought in to do any of the screenwriting, or he just wasn't involved with that at all?
He wasn't, because he spent the first part of his career strictly as an author.
Okay.
And then he eventually, and many authors do, they eventually migrate to the big money, which is Hollywood.
Yeah.
I mean, even if you have a bestseller,
doesn't make money like a movie.
You're not going to be really rich as an author.
Sure.
Unless I'm trying to think, some of these guys who write lots and lots of these mystery books.
Well, so there's a great one here in town. You know Clive Cussler?
Yeah.
So Clive passed away actually, but him and his wife live in PV. And yeah, that was the evolution. He wrote a whole bunch of his books, and then when the movies started coming, that's when a lot of the money started coming, right?
Right. And so the same thing with Richard Price. Some of his books were made into movies.
Sure.
And then he, started writing the screenplays for his books, for movies based on his books. And so at this time when this movie was going down, he wasn't quite in that position yet. No, this was his first effort.
Right.
So he's commuting back and forth, and at the same time, the Warriors they're getting organized as well, and they each know about each other, and they each know that they're essentially teen gang movies.
So they're filming the same time in the same place.
Yeah. There's competition for extras and stars, and there were no stars really in either of those movies.
Right.
These were movies that nobody thought would make money.
Mm-hmm.
They were for teenagers, low budget, and there really were no stars. So he's commuting back and forth. But The Warriors, which was directed by Walter Hill, who's kind of well known for people who follow authorship of movies as a director of action movies.
Sure.
And Warriors certainly was an action movie. And there was nobody famous then at the time. But in The Wanderers, Karen Allen, who became more famous because of she starred in the first Indiana Jones movie.
Yeah, okay.
So that was probably her next movie after The Wanderers.
Wow, okay.
But she had made one movie before that, Animal House.
Oh, wow.
So she was in Animal House the year before The Wanderers. So she was really the only one with any movie creed.
Any street cred for it, right? Yeah,
exactly.
I love it.
And everybody else was new. And Phil Kaufman, he had an idea of who he wanted to play the lead. But then this guy comes in pretty much off the street.
Sure.
His name's Ken Wahl, W-A-H-L.
Okay.
And he looks at Ken Wahl and he says, "Oh, you're the man." Tall, good-looking guy. Right. He's on the cover of the book, The Wanderers. So that's Ken Wahl. And he was perfect for the lead in the movie. But everybody else was also very good. So it's essentially a male movie because it's about the teen gangs. They're all
of course.
They're all
there's a love interest
men.
in there somewhere though, right?
But there's two women of interest. One is Karen Allen, and the other one was Tony Kalem.
Okay.
And she had done some bit parts before. But Karen Allen was most famous for this movie. But I always thought that Tony did the better work. She had the harder job. Karen Allen was the pretty girl that Ken Wahl, the leader of the pack, fell for. But he was already engaged to Tony Kalem. She had the harder job. She had to be the sort of the bitter girlfriend. So that was the recruiting. And then, I mean, everybody else was perfect for the role. And The Warriors was an adrenaline movie.
Right.
And I said, as I said before, this was it turned out to be a coming of age movie. But Phil Kaufman adopted the George Lucas methodology that he used in American Graffiti. If you remember American Graffiti, it was wall-to-wall 50s music in the background.
Yeah.
And that's what Phil Kaufman did. He did wall-to-wall pop music
Sure.
from the times,
Right.
that period of time,
Mm-hmm.
for his movie. And the movie takes place in the early 60s.
Right.
So it was like the 50s teen gangs, but they still slid over into
Sure.
the 60s.
Sure.
So that was The Wanderers.
I love it. I can't wait to read it. So let's switch gears a little
Sure.
bit. So Steve, we come out of COVID. And so this year, 2023, you've got 4 books coming out. So kind of tell us, how did that happen? I mean, because that's prolific, right? I mean, how long have you been working on this set?
So the first book,
Uh-huh.
the first one, which is, I have to look. There's 4 of them, so I have to figure out which
Sure.
one was the first one. Oh, the first one was All I Want Is Loving You, and this is about the white female singers of the 1950s.
Okay, sure.
So just about when COVID hit, maybe before COVID hit.
This is the one, right?
Yeah.
All right.
So the full title is All I Want Is Loving You, Popular Female Singers of the 1950s. And it's really about the white female singers. And I think before COVID, so I grew up in the 50s,
Mhm.
and I was really a kid, wild about this new thing called rock and roll.
Sure.
I mean,
Loved it, huh?
my
Yeah.
heroes were Little Richard and
Yeah.
Chuck Berry,
Right.
and, Elvis Presley.
Mm-hmm.
But popular on the radio were singers who weren't yet they were before rock and roll.
Sure.
And for the male singers of the time, they really all wanted to be Frank Sinatra.
Yeah, and the Rat Pack thing, right?
Yeah, so even from 1950 to 1955, there were what I would call post-swing
Mhm.
singers. So they were singing pop music, but it was really, everybody wanted to be Frank Sinatra.
Sure.
So they sung like that. So you had guys like Eddie Fisher and Al Martino, and names that have disappeared. Even the first round of Tony Bennett,
Mhm.
when he became a star, they were all trying to sing in a post swing era kind
Sure.
of style. So I went and I wouldn't listen to them.
Mhm.
I just wanted rock and roll, but popular on the radio were a lot of female singers at the time, and I wouldn't listen to them either.
Yeah.
So they were Rosemary Clooney,
Right.
and Patti Page, and even Teresa Brewer, who I put her picture on the cover,
Mhm.
because when she hit big in 1950, of all the popular female singers at the time, she was the only one who was a teenager.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I focused on her.
Sure.
And her backstory sort of goes through the book.
Mhm.
So I should explain what that book is, and I'll tell you how it all started. So that book is about the popular female singers of the 50s, and I do it on a year-by-year basis.
Okay.
So I look at, for example, 1950, and I figured out who were the female singers who charted
Sure.
that year. And then I
Go through their backstory.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
then I talk about that year, what songs were big by these singers,
Mhm.
and then I tell their backstory.
Sure.
So as I mentioned, I wasn't really interested in the 50s about these singers, but as I got older, and I always thought, gee, I wonder what happened to their career.
Yeah.
Because as the 50s came on, they sort of disappeared. So when I looked into it, I discovered that the first well-known period where female singers really were one of the dominating factors in pop
Mhm.
music was the early 60s, and that
Okay.
was the era of the girl group singers.
Sure.
The Chiffons, the Chantels, the
Yep.
Shirelles, and they had all these great songs.
Right.
But actually, the first time that female pop singers really gained prominence was the early 50s. And I went back and looked at some of these singers
Sure.
of the time, and they really had the best songs of the early 50s prior to the advent of rock and roll.
Sure. Sure.
I mean, Rosemary Clooney, she really had some great songs. Patti Page had wonderful songs. and they're lesser known female singers like Jo Stafford, lesser known to us, but she was popular at the time. One of the great songs from the early 50s, You Belong to Me, begin, see the pyramids along the Nile.
Yeah.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Totally. So, well, tell us a little bit. So how does that evolution then come? I mean, that's one book. Was that the first one you were working on?
Yeah. So,
and then you go on, you're done with it. What happens?
So I think I thought of the concept of the book before COVID.
Right.
But then COVID hits, and everybody sort of went into a cave.
Yeah. Right.
And, even though we live out here in sunny Arizona, everybody sort of went in because nobody knew what was going to happen with COVID.
Right.
And I said, okay, I got this concept of the book. I'm going to write this book. And I just sat down and just kept working on it.
Sure.
And COVID hung around.
Yeah.
So I just kept going. So I wrote that one. And it came out, and I was pleased with the effort.
Sure.
And I realized, well, I only told half the story of the 50s.
Right.
I only told the story of the white female singers. What happened to the black female singers?
Sure.
So I started researching that, and I realized they had a different arc. So, as I mentioned, this was a really great time for female singers, the early 1950s, for the white female singers. Then rock and roll comes in, and their career begins to ebb through the 50s because rock and roll is taking over.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them had careers that kept, not that the careers did not ebb, but they had hits. So you had, in the late 50s, Peggy Lee, her great song Fever. Patti Page had some of her best hits, Old Cape Cod, Allegheny Moon. These were in the late 50s. A singer, Edie Gourmet, who started in the 50s, didn't hit till the 60s. So I tracked all these people.
Absolutely.
But the arc was different for the black female singers. So they were actually segregated to the R&B charts.
Okay.
They were really popular in the R&B world. Singers like Dinah Washington, and there were a whole bunch of black singers that we forget about as well. And but when the rock and roll era comes in, they were singing rhythm and blues. That was like the precursors to rock and roll. So as rock and roll moves in, they sort of have their career picks up, and the record sale picks up because now they're being played on all record stations. So you get somebody like Laverne Baker. In 1955, she has this song Tweedledee, which most people at least heard of, if they don't know the song. But it was really a rock and roll song. So she was part of the movement to rock and roll. And her song, Tweedledee, got played not just on black stations, but on the white pop stations as well.
Wow. Okay.
So
she was a crossover at the time.
So they all began to pick up steam. Then I sent her on talk about Ruth Brown a lot. Very popular in the R&B world in the early 50s, but then, she gets crossover as well. And the backstory for the white singers was Teresa Brewer. For me, the backstory for all the black singers was Dinah Washington, because she was a star in 1950, but she had her greatest hit in 1959. Oh, wow. What a Difference a Day Makes. A monster record for her. So there's another example where the whole career arc was different for them. So I just moved from that, from the first book. And the second book, so I sort of have to read it as well.
What a difference a day makes, right?
Yeah. So I have Dinah Washington. That's Dinah Washington on the cover. What a Difference a Day Makes. Women who conquered 1950s music. And So that's about the black female singers of the 50s.
And then we're going into Earth Angels.
And then, I just kept going.
Yeah, you did.
I mean, it was crazy. I wasn't, I was a travel writer and a freelance business writer for 30 years.
Okay.
And I always traveled. I was always overseas for
Yeah.
years and years. I was always overseas traveling someplace. And I wasn't traveling anymore during the time of COVID.
Right.
So I just kept working. And I had written a book about Screamin' Jay Hawkins,
Mm-hmm.
probably now 5-6 years ago. People don't remember the name Screamin' Jay Hawkins, but everybody remembers his song, I Put a Spell on You.
Yeah. Put a spell. Yeah.
So
Hilarious.
Screamin' Jay Hawkins was probably one of the top 3 craziest people in the the last 50 years
Wow.
who recorded. So that was an interesting book. But he had this comment of, he was in the hotel in Harlem, and he was drinking with these guys who were popular at the time, and they all got drunk on wine, and they took the clothes off and were just laying in the hallways and passing out.
Sure.
And he mentioned them, and these guys were Johnny Ace, Guitar Slim, and Jesse Belvin. And I was curious because I knew the story of Johnny Ace. I wrote a book called The Death of Johnny Ace.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense.
So in 1954, Johnny Ace at a concert in the Houston Auditorium, Christmas Day, blows his brains out in the dressing room.
Wow.
And everybody said he was playing Russian roulette and killed himself.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. So it's always been unclear. He definitely blew his brains out.
Yeah.
But how that happened was unclear. So I had written a sort of a novel. I wrote 3 novels about. One was The Death of Johnny Ace. The second one, so that was about the 50s. Then I wrote The Seduction of Mary Wells.
Mm-hmm.
It was 3 parts.
Okay.
And that was my second book, and that was about the 60s. And then I wrote The Friends of Billy Preston, and that was about the 70s. So it was 3 books, which I called the R&B set. So I knew about Johnny Ace, and I knew he had a controversial death. And then I looked up the other guys. Jesse Belvin, I knew he wrote Earth Angel, hence
the book
title
cover,
of the book. And he wrote another song called Goodnight, My Love, which was very popular in the 1950s. And and then I found out he had a controversial death as well. And then, okay, so what happened to Guitar Slim? And he was the only one that I didn't know. So I had to research
Did some research on him, yeah.
So his death wasn't as controversial, but they all died young. And I said, well, here's a book.
Sure, absolutely.
3 guys, very important to the pre-rock and roll era.
Right.
And they all died young.
Yeah.
So that's how Earth Angels came about.
Wow.
So
your COVID was busy.
Yeah, so I just kept working during COVID. And again, part of it was I used to travel so much, and then I wasn't traveling at all.
Yeah,
Zero.
I was not. Yeah, totally.
So I just kept writing.
Yeah, 100%. So tell us a little bit about the event on Monday. So you're going to show the Wanderers. Are you going to be speaking, kind of introducing the book?
Yeah, so I'll be signing books. I'll be speaking, talking about the Wanderers.
Sure.
And then we'll show the movie, and we're going to have some New York style snacks.
I love it.
Most importantly, and we had to do some training here.
Sure.
A very popular drink in New York was called the egg cream, which was basically just a chocolate soda.
Sure.
Which if you went into a luncheonette or a soda
Diner
fountain
counter
shop
or whatever,
or any of that, you'd ask for an egg cream, and it was basically they'd put chocolate syrup, milk, and seltzer. That was the 3 ingredients.
So there's no egg in it.
There was no, and there's always some debate, but I think people say there was really no egg in it, but it was called an egg cream, and that was a very, very popular drink.
Sure.
So We'll have egg cream.
Sure. Love it.
There. So I don't think they'll use You Bet chocolate syrup because
might be a tough one to get. Huh?
It's the JCC, Jewish Community Center.
Yep.
And there might be something in the chocolate syrup that we can't have.
Yeah. There you go. Totally. Right.
So egg creams, maybe black and whites, and whatever else we'll do at the time. So there will be snack food there as well. It'd just be a fun event.
Sure.
So again, it's me signing books and the big intro for. I'll talk about the movie and how, just like we're doing it here. They'll show the movie, and if you want, you can have some snacks there as well.
Fantastic. So again, that's Monday the 13th, I believe,
right
at the Jewish Community Center, which is right down Scottsdale Road.
Right down Scottsdale Road, just down the road from you.
Yeah, right up Scottsdale Road. So tell us a little bit, like where, obviously your books are on Amazon, I would assume.
Yes.
Website, any kind of stuff like that?
I don't use a website.
Okay.
I have 4 different sites on Facebook.
Okay.
One of them is on me.
Sure.
But one of them is on my books.
Right.
So I use that as the website. It's called the R&B Set.
Okay.
So you can go to Facebook and Steve Bergsman, you friend me.
Yep.
But there's also the R&B Set and Screamin' Jay Hawkins. And so I use that as my
that's right.
page.
We do the same thing. That's our
platform
as well. Totally. I get it.
It's too much work to.
I'm
writing all these books. Too much work to do a web page because then I got to maintain it as well.
100%. 100%. So I really appreciate you being here. Before we wrap up, anything else that you want to talk about? Anything else you want to throw out there?
Yeah, I do. Okay. So next year, in early next year in April,
we're going to cover the 70s now, huh?
But yes, the 70s a little bit. So I'm doing a co-write on a memoir, which is coming out in April of next year. And it's with a singer-songwriter. Most people don't know the name. Her name is Carol Connors.
Okay.
So as a teenager, 16-year-old teenager, before she changed her name and she was Annette Kleinbard, she got together with 2 other schoolmates to form a group called the Teddy Bears.
Okay.
So, and one of her the 3 singers, 2 guys, Marshall Lee, Annette Kleinbard, and a fellow called Phil Spector.
Okay.
And people who know Phil Spector.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before he went crazy and started shooting people, he was one of the great producers of music in the 1960s, and that's where he made his name.
Right.
Produced so many of the great girl group songs, worked with the Beatles.
Sure.
But here he was, just out of high school. He finds Annette and his friend Marshall. They form the Teddy Bears, and they sing a song called To Know Him Is To Love Him, which was a number 1 song for something like 8 weeks, and number 1 song probably around the world, actually.
Sure.
So Phil Spector goes on to his amazing career. Marshall Lee hangs around the music industry for many years, but Annette changes her name to Carol Connors and becomes a very well-known songwriter.
Oh, okay.
She's the only female to have a surfer hot rod song.
Right.
And hit.
Yeah.
And that was Hey Little Cobra in the early 1960s.
Oh, wow, that's great. Right.
Come the 70s, she's writing for movies. She's writing songs for movies. She co-wrote Gonna Fly Now, the theme song to Rocky.
Right.
And
fantastic.
That's her career. I mean, very well known in that world.
Sure.
And but she's also a very, very pretty and sexy young woman, and she had a wild time, a wild life in Hollywood.
Right.
So that's the story she tells. And I have to try and remember the names because the name of my books are always so complicated.
Sure.
So and her first lover was Elvis Presley.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So the title of the book is Elvis, Rocky, and Me, Carol Connor's wild ride through the film and music industry, earning Grammy, Emmy, Golden Globe,
Wow.
Oscar nominations,
Sure.
Famous Boyfriends, Phil Spector's Enmity, Carol Shelby's Cobra, and I don't remember the rest.
How are you going to get that all on the cover?
Yeah. And that book is coming out next year
in April.
In April,
love it.
So that's Carol Connor's, and so if you have to remember it, it's Elvis, Rocky, and Me.
Yep.
And forget
a
the
whole bunch more
subtitle because it's all down there.
Yeah, totally. Well, we really appreciate it, Steve. Thank you, Steve Bergsman, local author from Mesa, world travels, fantastic books. Look for The Wanderers on Amazon, and then hopefully a lot of people see you Monday at the JCC. It sounds like it's going to be a great time.
Oh, it'll be fun.
Love it. Love it. Thank you.
Thank you.